Welcome then to this week's episode. We are on episode 14, as we are looking particularly this week at the reasons why behaviour fails in the school, where it comes from, what are the solutions, and kind of what we can try to avoid. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome then to this week's episode. And episode 14, we are looking at the reasons why behaviour might fail in a school. And there can be numerous reasons, but we'll go through a few of them. So basically, when we're looking at why behaviour fails in a school, it means that it's not being dealt with appropriately, or there's lots of poor behaviour or lots of incidents. And it can be for a number of things, whether it's based on teachers or leadership, can be down to individuals or the kind of whole school policy. So we'll go through a couple of ideas and solutions, reasons why there might be a problem, and hopefully might suggest a few ways of trying to deal with them. Now, I've experienced a number of these things from working in schools where it's worked, where it's not worked, some of it through being my own fault, through learning things, some things down to other people. But what's really important is that we do make an effort to change the behaviour in schools to get it right. So if we start off, first of all, one of the main reasons why a school might start to struggle with its own kind of behaviour is that it just doesn't have the right or an adequate policies in place. So in other words, the policies it's got might not be fit for purpose, might not be the latest, in terms of following the guidance from the government, or even thinking about the best ways in which to deal with behaviour. It's not clear. So having a good policy is a starting point. We've mentioned this many times before, but it's about following that policy as well. So the policy has to be fit for purpose. It has to be communicated to basically all the stakeholders in the schools, whether it be pupils, whether it be staff, parents, governors. It needs to be communicated, and it needs to be regularly kind of used and updated, and people need to know what's in it. And one of the things I think is really important when you've got a school policy is that you put it into some sort of child speak. So you put it into a student friendly version. And that's where you can get like a student council to help you with that. And I would say that the first point of kind of dealing with any behavior in any school is starting off with the student council or the student voice and listening to them. So go through the policy with them, show them the policy, ask them to create it in their own words or to summarize it and make like kind of one statement or one page summary document of the policy that you can then share with pupils, with staff, and with parents, so you can over communicate that policy. And we'll come back to over communicating and kind of the culture of the school in one of the later ones. So that's your starting point, is looking at the policy, because if you've not got a good policy, what are you going to follow? What are the rules? What are the kind of the expectations for staff and students and parents to follow as well? Because remember, it's not just about communicating with the students, it's about making sure parents are aware. The classic kind of scenarios are things that we come up against when it comes to behavior are around where parents don't necessarily support the school, and it could be really silly things like uniform or jewelry or piercings. In particular, students go on holiday, they decide to get a nose piercing done, an eyebrow piercing done, they come back and then it causes a problem with schools, and that's where parents need to support schools a lot more. So by over communicating something, it makes it far easier to deal with, because you can say, well, we've said it on a number of occasions. Particularly when I've worked with parents and students on this, I will repeat the same things over and over again, to the point where you almost want it to become a little bit boring, a little bit repetitive. So that's your school policy, and making sure you've got an adequate policy in place. Classrooms, next thing really, and these aren't in any particular order, they're not in the kind of priority order of just things that I've kind of come up with that I think are important. So classrooms are really important in terms of the environment that students are in. That can cause a lot of problems if there's graffiti everywhere. I had a friend of mine who used to run a pub, still does run a pub, but a different pub, and he used to say that if you had a piece of graffiti on a Friday night, if you didn't kind of paint over it or clear it off on the Saturday morning, then by the end of Sunday, on the Sunday evening, there'd just be graffiti everywhere on that wall. And so the environment and how the environment looks has a massive impact to play on behaviour of students in school, because if there's litter everywhere, and if you read up on lots of different books and documents and things online, people say that I used to think years ago, when I used to see head teachers going around picking up litter and things like that, I used to think it was really weird, and I actually find it quite interesting. I've changed my opinion on this. I used to think, why are you picking that up? That's not your responsibility. Get somebody else to pick that up. And then I realised it's about modelling the behaviour you expect to see from other students. And so now I will find myself picking things up, but making a point of saying, look, it's not beneath me to pick up, even though I'm paid this much and I'm this person and in this position. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we all have a responsibility to look after the school and the environment. So picking up litter is really important, and it's important to be seen doing that by the students. So the environment, the classrooms, simple things like display boards. If you allow them to get tatty, once someone starts peeling one part off, they'll peel the rest off. So if you see something, you got to fix it. you've got to make it look right. If someone puts a little bit of graffiti on the wall, paint it, clean it up, deal with it straight away. The longer you leave something, the more it will grow. And also what it says to students, it communicates to them that it's okay. And actually, it's, you can see that piece of rubbish there, or you see that graffiti, you go, oh, I'll add to that because, why not? So classrooms are important, and how you set out the tables and desks. We talked about seating plans before. The environment, whether you've got the students with the sunlight coming in, you've got broken blinds, it's going to disrupt them. That affects behavior, and that ultimately can make or break a school just by the environment. So these are really small things that are easy to change, but some of them are from a whole school point of view. There are more from a senior leadership point of view, particularly policy and the environments. If you've not got the funding to sort out sort of the environments, that can cause an issue. And obviously we know there's funding problems in schools at the moment anyway. So really just think about what you can do and what you can affect change on. If it's your own classroom, you can keep it tidy, you can update the display boards. If it's from a middle leader or a senior leader point of view, then you can look to fund things through budgets for the other stuff. And obviously senior leadership, head teacher, are responsible for your policies. Next one then is about training and CPD. So I think whenever you're launching a policy, if you're updating your policy, we did ours this last year, you need to communicate it to staff. You need to be really clear with staff what's in the policy, what the expectations are. Over communicate every opportunity. So have a rotating theme around your expectations. So we do things on uniform, we do hands up for silence, we do walking on the left hand side in the corridor, all those sort of things we have on a regular rotation. And it's not just about reminding students, it's about reminding staff as well, because ultimately there's so much information for staff to take on board that it's easy to forget if you've got all of these different things going on. And so that's why we have our tutor PowerPoint, where the theme for each week goes into the tutor PowerPoint, so that we can have that repetition. It's part of the training of staff. But you need individual training sessions, you need to go through systems and procedures, and you need to communicate with staff. But it's important that you get the feedback from staff as well on those training sessions. So one of the things that we've got coming up is we're going to look at some scenario based sort of training. And what I'm going to do is going to communicate with staff early on beforehand to say, what are the sort of things that actually you find difficult in the classroom? What are the sort of incidents and behaviour that you struggle with? And then we can build that into the training. So communicating with staff and finding out what their issues are, again, is one of the key things to developing a school and moving the behaviour on. Having that dialogue, ultimately, the staff who are there day in, day out dealing with the behaviour have got far more understanding of what the problems are than you have if you're a middle leader or senior leader. So going back to them, finding out. So staff training is essential really for moving the school on, because if staff don't feel equipped to deal with behavior, then they're not going to. And if they're not going to, that's going to affect morale, and that everything that leads to this kind of spiraling downhill in terms of students who then taking advantage of things because they realize the teachers aren't going to deal with stuff. So that's CPD, training for staff. And then linked with that really is the next part, which is poor support from SLT or inconsistent enforcement of rules. So one of the things that I've seen done badly in schools, particularly in the past, is where you've got heads of year will issue different sanctions for things that students have done wrong. And so what you need to be really clear on is making sure there's consistency within the team, within your kind of middle leaders, heads of year, SLT. And again, that leads back to training. So you've got consistency, but it's about making sure that things are followed through and that everyone knows what the kind of the lines are in the sand, so to speak. So if you know that you don't tolerate any swearing, everyone's really clear that you don't tolerate swearing, whether that being a teacher reporting it and then it being dealt with by SLT, or SLT actually making sure they follow through and deal with stuff. Where behaviour starts to spiral out of control is when you've got inconsistency, where you've got SLT who don't want to deal with things. I've worked in the past previously for head teachers, not many thankfully, but I can certainly think of one or two who've been reluctant to suspend or exclude for certain incidents, and they've held off, said no, we're going to got to keep its suspensions down, we mustn't be excluding students, and I get that there is a place for that. But also what it does then, it means that students then go, well, so this I'll call your bluff. And so if you say, well, we don't accept swearing, then you start to say, well, we don't want to suspend them for that, or we're not going to exclude them, etc., etc. Then what happens is the students will go, well, you're scared to do it, you're scared to follow through on it. So yes, it's important to keep suspensions down, but not at the detriment of behaviour in the school. Ultimately, if a student warrants a sanction, they should get it, not because you're scared to issue it. And that's where I've seen senior leaders and head teachers fail in the past, is that they don't deal with incidents because they're scared of numbers and data. And I can talk from experience in a recent inspection where I was able to justify our suspensions, and they were deemed to be adequate and they were deemed to be proportionate. And it wasn't really an issue because I could justify and show the data and show how we were improving the school. based on the fact that we weren't scared to issue them if we felt it was necessary, and those numbers have come down. So that's really about your senior leadership team, and it's also about how confident your head teacher is. For me, head teachers that are scared to do those things are insecure. They're people who are more worried about the data rather than the data they run in the school. The data will take care of itself if you run things properly. You have to have that confidence and commitment to say, no, we don't tolerate this. Communicate it, stick to it, and don't worry about the data, because the data will eventually fall in line. So a poor SLT support, poor head teacher can have a significant impact, and that's a difficult one to deal with, because ultimately you can't change a head teacher yourself. That's down to them. That's down to them to do the right thing. And so that's really about picking the right school we want to work with, because unfortunately you just can't change them, unless it's like previous schools where I've worked in, where thankfully they've been moved on. Currently in my school, I work for a great head teacher who is very supportive, and we deal with things and we're consistent, and so that's the way it should be. So senior leadership team is incredibly important, that they get things right, and they can make or break a school, particularly a head teacher. They can make or break a school on behaviour by having the right attitude, by dealing with things appropriately. So I can't really help you with changing that one. You've got to pick the right school to go and work in. But unless you are a senior leader or you are a head teacher, in which case it is down to you. Next one then, lack of support of administration. Basically, you need admin support. So whether that's non-teaching staff that support you in terms of the pastoral kind of dealing with things and getting statements and following up on issues and making phone calls, or whether it's people who are going to be issuing letters or typing those things up, you need them. And if you don't have that capacity, then it means that you're not having the time you need to be able to deal with things. Ultimately, the best time for you as a teacher, middle leader, head of year, SLT, whatever it is, needs to be in the classroom or in and around the school. That's where your best use of time is. And if you're taken away from that because you're sat at a desk, then you're not being effective. Ultimately, you can't just be sat there doing paperwork, so you need the admin support. Linked to that is insufficient resources. So the way I would see this is about having a good system. I've worked in schools that have had no system at all and just using things like Sims. And don't get me wrong, Sims is fine. Sims is great. You can use it, but it's just clunky. And so if you've got an online system, whether it be Class Charts or one of those kind of systems, we use Class Charts. I have done in the last kind of 3 schools, including this one that I'm in. Class Charts is just a really simple way of logging your behavior. An online platform, really easy to use. There are other platforms that you can use, which are just as good. It's just that I'm familiar with this one. And basically, you log all your behavior on there, and then it's just really easy to use for staff as well. And it's also useful for parents to see what's going on with behavior. And again, it's about like communicating with parents about culture. We'll do a whole video separately on culture and developing the culture of a school, which links to lots of these things, really. But having a good kind of system to log behavior on is essential, because it's going to provide you with data. It's going to be a way of communicating those issues with parents and students. It's hopefully a system that might also manage your detentions. So if you have it all in one, like I say, we use Class Charts. It not only does all of that, but it communicates with parents. We can send them text messages. We could do attendance on it. We don't currently, but it also does homework on there. So it covers a lot of the bases. And it just means that it's also got seating plans. It means that you've got a really good way of logging all the behavior issues. If you don't have a system like that, it just makes it hard. It's not impossible. Some schools manage perfectly well with just Sims. I'm not saying if you don't have that system, your behavior system will fall apart. It just makes things easier. So I put it down on the list as being one of those things that's useful. Next is low teacher morale and accepting poor behaviour. So in other words, if you've got teachers who feel unsupported, particularly if it's unsupported by SLT, and I'll talk about the 2 things that really govern behaviour in schools, which is SLT and teachers. Okay, those 2 things will make and break behaviour in schools. And what I mean by that is, more often than not, you've got all of these lists that I'm going through now in terms of behaviour and impact on behaviour and why behaviour falls apart in school, but it really boils down to 2 things: either lack of support from SLT or lack of response from teachers. That's the crucial part with solving behaviour in schools, because all the other stuff is essential, but you can work your way around it. But if you've got an unsupportive SLT, you're never going to move behaviour on. And if you've got staff who don't want to follow the system, you're never going to move behaviour on. So you need those 2 things to align. More often than not, when I think there's a behaviour problem in a school, it's one of those is out of sync. Either you've got a really supportive SLT but staff don't want to follow the system, or you've got staff that try to follow the system but aren't supported by SLT. That more often than not is the reason. It's not the only reason. Like I said, I've been in many different schools, and there can be plenty of other reasons, but those are the main ones. You will start to see improvements in behaviour if you get those 2 things right, because ultimately they're working together. So if you've got low morale, what happens, what basically means is that staff don't have faith in the system, they don't feel that they're going to be supported, and so they stop kind of following the rules and the expectations. So the things like they won't start doing the meet and greet in the classrooms, they won't be checking uniform, and that all comes down to morale. How do you change that? The simplest thing to do is you've got to get in and out of lessons. You have to develop the culture. Again, we'll talk about culture in another video. You've got to work with staff, you've got to listen to them, you've got to talk to them, find out what the issues are. The only way you can change morale is by working with the staff and talking to them, find out what the issues are, and then start to act on it. Now, don't get me wrong, you can't just be going around offering them loads of rewards and things, because ultimately there isn't the money to do that. You can't do it anyway, in terms of you can't be giving them financial rewards and things like that, and we don't have a bonus system within teaching as such. So the only way to do it really is to support them in the classroom, give them what they need, listen to what the issues are, and then try to combat it and show them that you're listening. That will help improve morale. But ultimately, low morale is a one-way ticket to poor behaviour, because what you'll find is staff stop reporting things and stop dealing with them because they just don't feel like anything's going to happen. And again, I've seen that happen in some schools that I've worked in and been to. So if you want to change behaviour, you've got to get staff on board. You've got to have a strong SLT. Next one then is ineffective communication with parents, staff, and students. Really focusing on parents with this one. Communicating the behaviour policy is essential. Mentioned that before. If you're not communicating it, you're not clear about it, it kind of says that you don't really know what you're doing because you're not confident enough to mention it. So what we do is we send videos out to parents talking through our behaviour policy, talking through the certain sections within that policy, so that we're really clear what the expectations are for students, but also what they are for parents. And by communicating that, what we're doing then is saying, hey, look, this is how we run things, need you to buy into what we're doing, and this is the culture we're trying to create. So communicating with parents, essential really. Family and social factors and local issues can affect behaviour, but it's not limiting really, because even if you've got a challenging sort of high deprivation area where students might not necessarily want to be at school, you can still change things, you can still motivate them, you can still make it interesting and exciting for them to be in there, just by the things that you do in creating that culture and environment. So again, culture is everything really if you want to change a school. Sometimes mental health issues can also be a factor that impacts on behaviour if you are not identifying them and supporting students, by making the referrals. Again, that comes down to funding as well, unfortunately. But having the right funding within the school and maybe having like a school counsellor and things like that can make a massive difference. Again, not all limiting factors on behaviour, but they can have an impact. And then the last one really that I think is quite important is just understanding what the needs are of the students. So having a really good Senko in a school can also help with behaviour. Again, I'm not saying it's essential. You could have a bad Senko and still manage things perfectly well. You're going to find it hard when it comes to those unmet needs. Whereas if you've got a really strong Senko with your kind of pastoral team, with someone in charge of behaviour and a supportive head teacher, that's your combination that you need. The Senko can be really, really essential to moving things on in terms of helping students get the provision that they need, helping them in the classroom, or maybe even looking for, getting students support externally from different agencies or directing them to the right provision. So a Senko can be instrumental in terms of helping support with behaviour. So those are my kind of top few or top list of what I think makes or breaks a school in terms of behaviour. Not sort of, it's not like you're saying if you've missed one, that's it, you can't do it. You can do it without some of them, but I think definitely it comes down to got to have staff on board and you've got to have a supportive SLT or head teacher. Without those, it's really difficult to move behaviour on, because ultimately those two have to work together. If you can't get those right, if you've got an SLT that aren't supportive of staff, who aren't going in checking on them, being there, that's going to affect morale. If you affect morale, then staff won't want to deal with issues. So those are probably the two important ones, but the rest are just as essential really in terms of backing up behaviour. Hopefully that's been useful listening to this time, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks very much. Take care.